good to be with y'all. It's a different space for us to do Sunday school in this room, but it seems important to be right here this morning. My name is Catherine Bush, part of the clergy team at Calvary Episcopal Church, and we welcome you this morning to this conversation, and those of you who are joining us online as well. I have been looking forward to this conversation for several weeks. As soon as the fabric sculpture went up, in early January, which we missed in the fall because of construction, and then there was this newness to all of this space and this freshness and light, and then when the sculpture went up and we saw how the light now cascades on the new floor, it's just been like everyone's seeing it again for the first time. So I'm thrilled this morning to be here with David Johnson, creator and visionary of this, and Leanne Kleinmann, who has her own intersecting story with these stories, as we take a moment to see where we are right now, but also to look back at a moment in time in Memphis and the church, and not limited here, obviously, but the story of the late 80s and early 90s, what it meant to be a member of the LGBTQ community at that time, and how people came through and found each other and found spaces and found hope. So I'm really, really honored. So David and Leanne, we'll start with y'all just telling us a little bit about, maybe start with a sentence or two about your life now, where you're working, what you're doing, how you're connected to Calvary, whatever you want to share. And then, if you will, take us back and tell us a little bit about your life in the late 80s and 90s as it pertains to this bigger story that we're a part of. So David, we'll start with you.
I am a hairdresser, a painter, and used to do a bit of decorating. Mm-hmm. Still consulting with that. But as of Friday was my last day in my shop, where I've been for 19 years. I've been in my profession for 60 years.
Wow. So we've caught you at a hinge moment. Yeah.
It's all happened within the past 3 weeks.
Wow. Yeah. Well, thank you.
But my partner and I, husband, found Calvary in the 80s. Very most welcoming church. I had tried a couple of others in town, but this hit it for me. In the 80s, AIDS was a death sentence. Mm-hmm. We had, of course, talked to Doug Bailey and a couple of other parishioners about friends that didn't have a minister, or their minister too would said, "We cannot do your funeral." Mm-hmm. And Doug was like, "We have to educate people." And committees were formed, wonderful volunteers started figuring out how to do that. And Doug kept saying in a meeting, "This is going to be an ecumenical service. We have to invite ministers from other faiths, get them to take part, and educate." They go back to their church and talk about it. Right. And those, we tried to do like 8 to 10 ministers for each year. But he said the first one has to be spectacular. And what can we do to make it special? He said, "David, you have friends in Washington, perhaps," but his statement, he kept saying, "This is going to be a service for people living with AIDS, okay, not dying of AIDS. So it's for everybody involved, parents, friends." So he kept saying, "Living with AIDS." And when he said, "You have friends in Washington, maybe we could get some of the quilt project here."
Oh, right.
Well, that living with AIDS meant so much to me that I said, "Well, Doug, that is a beautiful tribute, but it's to people that have died."
Right.
And we need something light and bright. And I don't remember my exact words, but I said, "I will have to think on that." And a banner came to mind.
But as we were just saying before we gathered, when some people hear banner, they think like a few feet of square fabric on a pole, right? Like a banner that we might carry in procession or something like that.
Exactly.
And you didn't mean that.
I didn't know what it meant.
Okay.
At the time. I did not have a clue. I said, I'm going to have to think on this. Well, many years later, I thought I had been to San Francisco and gone to Grace Cathedral.
Right.
And there was someone involved, a teacher, got students all over San Francisco teaching origami, birds.
Right, and they made the cranes. Yeah.
And they were all hung on individual strings, so it looked like they were flying through. Mm-hmm. And anybody that's not ever seen that, you just need to Google Grace Cathedral, bird sculpture. But anyway, I started sketching and thinking, in a simple way, the decorator in me, how to do this simply. A width of fabric became 3 widths of fabric. And I grew up painting, house painting with my father. And so I was not frightened by ladders at that point. So sketching, I came up with this design, the streamers, how I could cut a 6-inch width of fabric, fold it over 2 inches, spray glue, fold it over 2 inches. Thus, the streamers. And just remembering I'd had a salon where we had high ceilings, and I'd done the silver on the ceilings. And at Christmas time, I painted limbs and hung them from the ceiling of my salon. And then snowflakes out of permanent wave rods folded, making snowflakes. And
right.
that was just the basis for how this would be done.
Right. So, Leanne, hi. I want you to tell us a little bit about your life right now, but I also know, in your recent Substack article, and you and I have spoken about this, about what it means for you. The creation that he's describing is part of your story as well.
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit?
First of all, I'm so delighted to hear the story of the genesis of this beautiful sculpture, because it's really a question of the whole being greater than the sum of its parts. It never occurred to me that those were widths of fabric and how you would cut them, but every time it goes up, it's such an emotional day for all of us here at Calvary, but certainly for me. As you know, I'm a journalist and a writer and an editor. Right now, I run my own communications company, but for many years, I was a senior editor at the Commercial Appeal, and when I did the first World AIDS Day conversation in 1993, I had just left my position as editor of Memphis Magazine. So I was not in any community of LGBTQ people at the time. Of course, we wouldn't have called it that at the time. But when I lived in the 80s, I lived in Greenwich Village at the corner of Christopher and Greenwich Street, which some of you may know was the epicenter of both the gay community and of AIDS. So I had seen what was happening to my neighbors. I sang in a choral group at NYU, so I had many friends who got sick and had to go home or disappeared from our lives. And I was sad about it, but I had no imagination that it would ever have anything to do with me until 1988, when I discovered that my father was gay and had HIV. And the way I discovered it is that my mom had just died, and I found some notes in her desk. So it was a very emotional time and discovery. And the thing that I've always said about that time is that I didn't have any really time to think about what I thought of his choices, because I knew he was dying. Like you said, in the 80s, AIDS was a death sentence. There were only a few treatments in clinical trials at the time. My dad was in one of the early AZT trials. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, which is about as Midwestern and middle of the road as you can come. And one of the things that I've always said about my dad and his sort of double life is that he was never anyone different to me before and after I knew about his life. And in fact, he was much happier once I knew. Happy would probably not be the correct word. He was very afraid that my sister and I would not want to be in a relationship with him because it happened so often that men who had to come out because of this disease were shunned by their families, shunned by the medical community. And Memphis is a lot more conservative than the place that I grew up. So here I was as a public person, and my good friend and brave community leader, Cheryl Cornish, who was the pastor at First Congregational and is here with us today, asked me, we had talked voluminously about many things, but certainly about my dad. And in 1993, he died in 1993 in January, and in December, she decided to launch the first World AIDS Day celebration in Memphis, and she asked me to speak. I said yes because it was Cheryl, and I had told the story a million times, and I wasn't at all uncomfortable telling my story. I had no idea what I had done. I also agreed to speak to a newspaper reporter, which I now see was completely naive, even though I was one. My good friend David Waters wrote the story, and they put it on the front page of the paper with my wedding picture, with myself and my dad. And you're laughing, so you know what happened. It was like a bomb went off in my life. I mean, it's the reason that I wanted to tell this story now, and when the sculpture went up this year, I remembered it, is because you can't remember even in 1993, even in 2003, how very, very difficult it was to talk about AIDS, talk about LGBTQ issues. There was never an assumption of acceptance. There was at Calvary, and there was at First Congregational and other tiny pockets in Memphis, but there were many, many places where this conversation was absolutely forbidden. And in fact, the day that that story ran, I was, I'm trying to remember where I was exactly, but I was in a meeting with some clients who didn't know me particularly well, and there were fag jokes at the table. People were very uncomfortable with me. The good part of it, of course, is I also learned of many people in my life who had struggled with AIDS and deciding what their sexuality was and making the choices, and they were talking to me too, so that was nice. But man, it was really intense. And I think it's important for us to remember how things were then, because it's very different now. I'm not gonna say it's completely different now. There are many, many women and men in our community who don't have the choice to live the way they want to now. But then we didn't even talk about it. And the fact that I was as public as I was about it was, it was remarkable. I'm not sorry I did it. I wish I had been a little bit more cognizant of what I was actually doing. And the night of the World AIDS Day celebration, you were probably there, or you remember it. It was remarkable. The little tiny church in Midtown that was First Congregational then was packed to the rafters. And it was just such an affirming, wonderful acknowledgement of community. And that's how I feel when I see this banner every year as well.
Thank you so much. And I really, as you guys have said, you know, part of our conversation today is to capture that moment then of what it was like. Again, so much progress and goodness, and you're right that there's still people living fearfully and not welcomed and not embraced by their families and communities. So we remember that and honor that, even if we think, you know, oh, we're so enlightened now, right? That this is still the place of deep grief for families and individuals to be able to live their stories. In fact, even just this morning, again, before we gathered, several of us who seem very peripherally connected to these stories, we know people, we have family members, you know, for whom we were told, say it was a brain tumor, don't say it was AIDS, you know, say it was this, say it was that, or don't say it at all, right? And these stories are intertwined in so many of ours that it feels like bringing some air into the conversation to feel less isolated, to feel less alone. Like these are not, you know, we're not in these kind of pockets of fear. So I wonder a little bit more. So you guys have spoken about First Congos, First Congregationals, the World AIDS Day in '93. That was, I had forgotten that was still in the earlier church, not the one in the middle of Cooper Young. And that Calvary here was offering, initially, part of the ministry was burials, right?
Yes,
this was something that Calvary could do.
Calvary buried those two people
Okay.
that were not
otherwise going to have.
connected to Calvary.
Right. So these kind of figuring out these ways that these churches and these communities could offer, what we do in places and spaces. So I wonder if there are other stories or examples that you can offer about just kind of glimpses of that.
There was one person that was a friend of one of the people that came to the funeral, lived out of town. And at the funeral, he got in touch with me and said, I'm going to move back to Memphis. And he came and was actually worked in Calvary on the committee. Mm-hmm. He was a Baptist. And he came to Calvary for several years and then decided he wanted to go to his church. And it was a very liberal Baptist church where he actually got the same thing started.
Oh, nice.
And there on the corner of Parkway and Poplar, they actually had symbols in their,
on their lawn. They still put crosses and of those who.
He came to that through this ministry.
Oh, I didn't know that. So those of you who are local around here, so the story of First Baptist, it is, a Baptist church, but a much more progressive
Yes, there is one Baptist church. We had invited the minister, who's the only one that I know of, that turned us down. Mm. And his organist died of AIDS.
Wow.
He told his minister, and the minister said, you cannot say that and still work in this church. You have to call it cancer.
Wow. Yeah, so this is part of the secrecy and fear, right, and stigma. Yeah, right, yeah.
It's hard for me to weigh in on what was happening in the LGBTQ community in the 90s because it wasn't my community, really.
Yeah.
But I've sung in the choir at Calvary for many years, and the AIDS healing service, which is what this committee was put together to do, was a really interesting barometer of what was happening in the community, because there were people that we never had seen before, people that we wouldn't see again. The music was an integral part of it, and that was a really special thing for me because I was singing in the choir. And I think it also every year gave us a reason to have the conversation again, gave me a reason to have the conversation again with people who had not known about my dad or had forgotten or didn't want to talk about my story.
Right.
This bomb that I'm describing from the newspaper story came up every year. And I think that, and it sort of still does. Not in the same way at all. Mm-hmm. And the real, I can't say when the turning point was, but my niece, who is about to have her first baby, she's 30, has been always the keeper in our family of my dad's story. And she's always wanted to know more about him. And of course, it's very difficult for Jane and my sister and myself to talk about it, mostly because he died in 1988. We miss him. And I think, or he died in 1993. My mom died in 1988. It was a tumultuous few years there. And I think that telling the story again to my son, to his friends, my nephew and his husband live in London now, and he is my nephew is a writer and has written a wonderful history of the gay community in London, in the United States for teenagers.
Wow.
And we saw it when the Calvary Choir was in England last year in residency. We spent some time with them.
Right.
And it's so gratifying to me to be able to see how their lives are better for the conversations and the ability we have had to be more open about what really happened with HIV and AIDS.
Yeah. David, could you tell us a little bit more about, you were talking about, this is the banner that we're sitting under is not the original. You know,
No.
tell us a little bit about the actual creation and the work of this and how.
It was after doing drawings, figuring out the mathematics of what I was going to do. I did it on the dining room table by folding, pushing it as I would cut. And my partner would clean up all those
Must have been a lot to
pieces.
clean up, right?
And fold it at the other end on the floor. But that, again, it was all a learning process. It was a wonderful experience to do. And I stored it, folded it, stored it in the attic over my garage. 3 years in the heat of the attic of the garage. The last time I was taking it down, it started to shred. And it was just like, oh my goodness. So, well, you have to create another. And then I was just like, I found out how unqualified I was at working with groups. I thought, this will be wonderful. I can make some templates. We can get some volunteers. And that was the second one. And it was nice. But being the perfectionist, it was like, oh, if my name is going to be associated, I have to do another.
Oh, okay.
So thus, this.
So this is the third one.
This is the third one. But a little wiser, I learned that I had a sewing machine, and I made pockets so that each panel, there are 12 panels, and each rolled up. And the group that does this, the volunteers, is just incredible. The way they work together, I'm still impressed.
Yeah.
Because for years, I hung it, the first 3 years, I went up the ladder myself. And our ladder at that time did not reach the metal bowl. So 2 wonderful sextons said, if we put it in the pew, and they held it on each side.
Right.
And some of the pews were older and warped, and they would put a hymnal under one leg. And
OSHA somewhere is
yes.
panicking, right?
as I was climbing, I didn't realize that these lanterns, these beautiful lanterns, if you're standing on the top of a ladder and the heat comes on, they move.
They move just a little bit.
Just a little. So I prayed a lot. This made me much more
I was going to ask
spiritual.
how this brought you closer to God. So that's, yeah.
Oh, so much.
Yes.
So much more. There was more praying with putting this
Right.
up than I had done in a
Right.
long
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm still impressed every time it goes up. I did not take part for years. I just would come in and see it. But Madge invited me to come and take part 2 years ago, 3 years ago. Numbers are
That's right.
Anyway, so I've just come to witness and watch, and that is a phenomenon in itself.
It is.
It's
It really
beautiful.
is. And there's a whole team of folks.
choreographed.
Some of you are in the room right now. It's choreographed. They know what they're doing. These faithful folks who have come, and now generations of families who are coming. And we rely on not a ladder perched on the pews, but a fireman's ladder. So Fireman Pete comes with his actually like tall enough ladder. And it's a whole community effort. And I had never witnessed the process of it going up. So some of y'all are in the room. I see you now. And so I guess it was my first year back. No, it must have been my second year back here. And I came down and just spent the day just like, and there's time-lapse videos and there's pictures and you can go find all these things. But it's that in itself, it's like a barn raising, right? It's like the whole community, like this group of people who come and do it. And the other thing that I was thinking about, David, as you were sharing, you know, the first iteration and then stored in the attic and crumbling beneath your fingers, and thinking too about what we don't know about the future life of something, and that when you first made it, imagining even 2 years or 3 years later, that it would continue, and that there would be a cry for, no, we need to make another one. We need to carry it forward, and that now we're sitting here, 30 plus years later, again, and it's for people who walk into Calvary who know the story, and for people who don't know the story, who just come in and see this beautiful work of art that's had this long life and will continue.
And this being the 35th year that this service has happened is just phenomenal.
Yeah. All these anchors and moments and stories, which are a lifetime or more.
AIDS has changed so much from the beginning.
Right.
Just totally different. But there are still people that need to be aware and have needy, whether it's, a personal friend, a child, or...
I think it's also helpful to remember what AIDS showed us about the way we care for each other and talk about community and acknowledge illness. And I have to tell you, I felt some really strong vibrations when COVID happened.
Yeah, there's a lot of parallel.
Because there was a whole lot, you'll remember, there was a whole lot of fear around people breathing on you and touching you. And I mean to tell you, when my dad had AIDS, we were still in a very early stage of knowing how the virus was translated. Part of that was political because we didn't talk about it. We didn't fund research. It's really hard for me to talk about it because I lived in, as I said earlier, at the corner of Christopher and Greenwich Street in New York. So I saw that community in the early 80s is when I lived there. And remember, if my dad died in 1993 and he was in the first ACT trial, that's a long denial period, okay? So, and even when he was diagnosed, there were still moments when my sister and I thought, should we touch this glass? Should we run this dishwasher? And it was because we didn't know. And so the whole sort of political swirl around COVID and what we knew and what we didn't and wear a mask or not, there were some really strong echoes of that and some really strong reminders of how easy it is to marginalize people about whom we are afraid. And to me, when I see this, that's what I think about. How important it is for us to base our conversations and our acknowledgement in what we actually know, and to treat people with kindness first. I mean, it's hard for me to talk about what happened with my dad because I wasn't there. I mean, I had been married, we lived in a different city. The year after my mom died, we lived abroad. I was mad. I was angry that he didn't tell me. I was angry about the politics of it. And there were a lot of months that went by that I didn't talk to him. And I think that every family that has wrestled with accepting differences or different choices or choices they might not have acknowledged in the first place has this history too. So I think it's important to remember how imperfect our responses to these things actually were. I mean, now AIDS is I have any number of friends who take PrEP and it's great. And of course, AIDS is also still with us, with poor and marginalized, in Memphis, mostly women. And I think it's important to remember that maybe the story isn't over. And that's another reason why this sculpture has been so remarkably emotional and potent all these years.
As a gay man, even though I had friends that had AIDS before they passed on, I still was nervous about it. I caught myself thinking about a water glass, touching doorknobs, escalators, all the things that we become aware of again with the pandemic. Yeah. I went through the same thing. Yeah. Just like, you got to be careful.
Right. And so, thinking about the layers, and the same kind of connection about 6 feet apart, don't touch, all of these messages that we got, and thinking about, and then, people coming back around to understand, how important touch is and how important it is to be able to be with people in those moments, right? And that the cover of, oh, it's not medically safe, instead of being, kind-hearted and compassionate and sitting with someone, right? And that kind of using the language as an additional barrier too. And we've, as you said, we've all just lived through that.
Well, and the pastoral piece of this, Cheryl has done some wonderful writing about what happened in her church during this time. And I think, as a body of Christ, I think we have certain obligations to each other of presence, if nothing else.
Right.
And that was one of the things that made the AIDS epidemic so difficult, is that presence was really, it was broken for all sorts of reasons, not just medical,
right.
but certainly medical. And when I lived in New York in the late 80s, I could see what was happening, and the gay community was left alone,
right.
alone to cope with it. And I'm sure that's what happened here as well.
Well, and thinking about presence, and obviously in our Episcopal tradition, it's a common cup, and it's a piece of bread that I have to touch you to give you, and it's laying on of hands and anointing, right? Like we're so embodied. Mm-hmm. Our bodies are so important. We can think of ourselves, and we probably do a little bit as very staid Episcopalians who are, proper and all that. We touch a lot. We're bodily people. And so to have your body be deemed not safe or not, all of those things, it just the layers and layers and layers of that, and the angst and hurt. And then when you can't offer the things that we know are healing, it's an additional heartbreak.
Well, and gosh, I haven't thought about this in so long, but when my dad died, we had a lot of trouble getting nurses to help us.
Right, yeah.
My sister and I were the ones who took care of him and made the decisions for him and dragged people in to find out what was happening.
Yeah. Wow.
I'm going to see if there are folks who are here with us who have questions or comments or pieces of the story that you want to offer to us. Yeah. Wait, tell us who you are and use a mic.
I'm Cheryl Cornish, and I'm really touched. I'm going to make a comment about the aesthetics. I'm very touched sitting here about how the wall echoes this, and then with the light coming through, it's almost like a living extension from the foundation of the church itself, and I think it creates just a beautiful theology of we move out, from this foundation. It's very striking. If I was in the back, I bet it would have hit me even more, but it's a beautiful aesthetic, theological statement at the same time.
May I say to you, Cheryl, in all the years, I was inspired by that. But no, you were the first person to notice that, which was flattering to me that I got credit for all of this, but the decorator in me just absorbs whatever is around. When I walk into a room, I absorb it.
Yeah.
And the new colors in here just glorifies this.
Yeah.
It just
Absolutely.
is so fabulous.
Absolutely. Other questions or comments or pieces of the story? Yeah. Tell us who you are.
Hi, I'm Petker Tigrid, and I belong here, and it's great to see you both, and you, of course. I'm fascinated, like you and everybody else. It's so beautiful, and I'm all about fabrics, and so are these the initial ones that you had? Are they linen, cotton?
It is an unbleached muslin,
which
a parish Rose Johnston donated this fabric all 3 times.
Amazing.
Nice.
So it was the same fabrics for the new one as well, right?
This one and the first one.
Right.
Somehow the one in between was really, really white. I don't remember why that was, but the fabric was not. This is the same as the first
Beautiful.
one. Unbleached muslin.
It's amazing. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Other folks, your stories and Match.
First of all, thank you, both of you. It is such an incredible honor to be part of the team that does this every year. And we have so much fun, and Karen Karen came up with the map that helps us do it the right way every year, and we always laugh about 1 to 4 and 4 to 8 and all of the numbers that are a part of this. It is the best jigsaw puzzle experience every single year. It's just remarkable. But as we were talking about Doug and about the World AIDS Day service that was here for so many years, it occurred to me just sitting here this time, and I don't think I've ever thought about this before, that in all the years that we had that service and the wonderful collection of clergy from different faiths that were here, it just occurred to me that in all of the years that I went to the rail for a blessing, not only was I never blessed by Calvary clergy, but I was never blessed by an Episcopal priest. Whether it was Micah Greenstein or Cheryl Cornish or whoever it was always somebody from a different faith, and that was such a remarkable experience. And on a very personal note, my mother died in 2007, the night of the service. And Craig Strickland happened to do my blessing that night from Hope Church. And I had said to Craig, please pray for my mother. She's very close to death. We got home from the service, and an hour later, she died. And so I tie all of those things together with wonderful experiences at this church, the way we live out. God loves you, no exceptions. And the way this just continues to bless and grace people every single year. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Madge. And I think it's really lovely too, as Madge was saying and as Cheryl expressed, the integration of this into physically, right, but also theologically and spiritually into the warp and woof of what it's like to be at Calvary. For those of us who were married under this banner, knowing that it was beautiful and tragic, right, that was something to be sought after because it was so gorgeous, but also knowing that it wasn't just a pretty thing, right? And then thinking about all the collections of stories that, again, maybe peripheral or differently connected to life at Calvary, and thinking about Calvary's place. We've talked about liturgically offering burials, offering the memorial service, and then knowing that Calvary has also been a place of recognition of gay clergy, right, of early blessings of same-sex unions happened here, and those are vast stories that would require more time than we have to tell, but just to think about how it did kind of get into the architecture, right, and that those stories fed each other, and one piece of the puzzle enabled other pieces of the puzzle to come to light. So, other questions or comments? Yeah, Pat.
Your stories were spellbinding. Have you not written a book yet about it? You really should.
I'm looking for a real writer. I have been writing for a long time.
May I introduce you to Leanne Kleinmann? Other folks who have a piece of the story or a question you might want to share. But just let's do this real quick. If you are part of the team that puts this up, will you stand up? Because I know some of y'all are here. This is not everybody, but we've got a few folks who are part of the barn raising, the banner raising. Thanks, y'all. We're so grateful. Yeah.
There's a question right behind Andy.
Oh.
I'm Mary Beth Seltzer, and my oldest brother died of AIDS in 1989 in Chicago.
I'm sorry.
And Chicago was very progressive, if you could call it that, at that time. And he worked for a company, a nuclear energy company, and he wrote their newsletter. And they put him on disability so he could keep his insurance.
Wow. Wow.
In 1989.
in 1989.
That's impressive.
And he had a wonderful doctor at Presbyterian St. Luke's Hospital. And he became part of a group that was called the Brown Association. So nobody would know what it was really about. And it was a support group for people with AIDS. And he had a buddy. They would set you up with buddies. And his buddy was a 25-year-old woman, and he was in his 50s at the time. And he once said to me, why would anyone that age and want to be with me? And my answer was, why wouldn't they? You are so smart, so talented, you know so much, you're fun. He was a musician. At one point in his life, he was a high school teacher. And they moved to Chicago so he could get his PhD to teach in college. And everything just fell apart at that point because he lived in a place where he had to be in secret. And his wife knew. But when you went to Chicago and when you studied at the University of Chicago, it was all out there. And it was just too hard, too hard for him. And he ended up going into a group home run by the Catholic Church. He didn't want to at first, but then he loved it.
Good.
And they had an agreement with the Catholic Church across the street. So unless there was another place for a memorial service, that's where they had their memorial service. The church was full. I was the only one in my family that took communion because everybody else was afraid of the common cup. He was awesome. And Matt was born on his birthday.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mary Beth.
Oh,
Thanks for
nice.
sharing your story.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks. Other folks, a piece of the story that you want to offer, or a question, a comment? Yeah.
David, listening to your comments about the integration of this, the design of this beautiful banner with your perception of this room itself, and it just makes me think, and I think so often, looking at the organ screens and how the blend of this with the organ screen, how beautiful that is, and what a beautiful reminder it is all year long when this banner, when this is down, walking into the church and just from the back, and the first thing you really see is the organ screen. What a nice reminder that
echo,
is
yeah.
of the banner. And so it's just a lovely thought to have all year long.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks. So I'll give you all a chance to say maybe a little bit about how you see, I mean, we've talked about how this story connects with our lives today, but what you would want to offer in terms of a comment or a blessing on us or this time in the story, or something that you haven't had a chance to share yet that you wanted to offer. Leanne, you want to start?
I guess the thing that is so clear to me today is the importance of remembering. It's so easy to get involved in our busy lives and forget the details, especially about stories that are particularly painful. Mary Jo, thank you so much for sharing the story of your brother. I think often about the guys that I sang with in New York and the people that I knew early in my time here in Memphis and wonder how things worked out. But one of the things that seeing this banner every year gives me an opportunity to do is think about my dad and what he was, in addition to the fact that he was gay and he died of AIDS, because there were a whole lot of other things in his life and in my life. And the thing that I think certainly today is how he would just be thrilled with the idea that this community has meant so much to me, and I'm really sorry he never got a chance to see it.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
Can't think of another thing to add.
Okay. Well, I can add my gratitude. Thank you.
Thank you.
Not only for 35 years of this gift, but today, of the vulnerability of your story and your willingness to share it with us, and recognizing the importance of memory and remembrance, and to pull that back up into this moment. And I'm appreciative of all of y'all here for coming to share these stories, and knowing that everybody here has another quiet story as well that you may or may not have shared, but that we're all intertwined in that way. So I'm exceedingly grateful and appreciative. So thank you both. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
Go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Thanks be to God.
It's just wonderful to get to hear you tell that story.
Thank you.
I'm so happy to hear the context of it.
Thank you.
That's just great.
And thank you for making it so easy.
Microphones, and I'll unhook you.